Good afternoon, and thank you for participating in this webinar. Today we will discuss the National Transit Database requirements for sampling and guidance. My name is Judy Kolva, your NTI representative. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. We are pleased to have Sergio Maya from the FTA as our presenter. Mr. Sergio Maya is an electrical engineer, has over 10 years experience working for the National Transit Database and over 20 years experience working in the transportation sector. Prior to the National Transit Database, Mr. Maya worked on the preparation of the St. Louis Metrolink Light Rail System Operations Plan and worked as a consultant to the World Bank. In his free time, he is an avid chess player and classical music lover.
Our topic today is the sampling requirements and guidance with a special focus on the National Transit Database Template Sampling Plan. And why we sampling in the NTD is that because it's a requirement of the law. The funding for transit agencies is based in part in the reporting of passenger miles traveled, and that is information that it's not usually collected by transit systems. It's part of their normal operations. And it's also an important measure of transit service. It's nothing more and less than the cumulative distance traveled by passengers in the system. So then what is required to determine passenger miles traveled is the boardings and alightings of each passenger, because we need to know the distance traveled by each passenger. So in most cases, the number of boardings, and I noticed that based on the polling questions, most of you have 100% count of trips, that most of you have a full count of boardings. However, alightings are not usually recorded, and therefore a sampling process needs to be used to determine ons and offs and distance traveled. And the FTA is issuing this guidance because of the existing FTA plans, and I noticed from the polling questions that a good number of you are using the existing Circular 2710.1a for fixed route, which is a very old sampling plan. It's old and outdated and requires sample sizes that are much larger than what you really would need in most cases to meet the 95-10% tolerance that FTA requires. So with this sampling guidance, we add the ability to customize sampling plans based on your specific data. So that means that you can have smaller sample sizes and save dollars. So the purpose of the package is for estimation of passenger miles traveled, and can also be used to estimate on-link trips when they are not available or they are not reliable. I noticed that most of you do have 100% count of trips, which is very good news because many options open up for you too in terms of sampling, and FTA requires that you report 100% count of trips when they are available. You are going to find in the package, there is a sampling manual and there is an Excel workbook with several tabs that I will show in a little bit, that has a way for you to enter your data and to see what options are available for you. And now for this second year of the sampling package, we added a new plan that it's based on sampling every X days. And if you recall, I'm sure that for many of you that are familiar with the plan for the Circular 2710.1a, it's based exactly on the concept of sampling every X days. And so we are adding this plan now because we know that many agencies like sampling in a systematic basis, every day, every second day, every third day, etc. And we are going to call, and I'm going to call this type of plan from now on, interval-based. So every time that I say interval-based plan, I'm referring to a plan where you sample systematically every day, every second day, every third day, etc. The package covers all modes and does not change the requirements of 95% and plus minus 10% margin of error. You don't need a certification from a statistician to use this plan. It's approved by FDA. It's voluntary at this point. So if you want to still use the old plans, you can. Or if you are using an alternative sampling plan, you can also do that. And key differences from old FDA plans is that it has more than one sampling plan, and the most important feature is that the sample size is not fixed, unlike the old plans. It depends on your data. So the data is feed into the system. And the sample is based on sampling every X days, as I said, is the interval-based sampling plan, or random selections within a weekly, monthly, or quarterly time period, which is another way of sampling, and I'm going to call this period-based sampling. In the period-based sampling, you sample weekly, but the day you are sampling is random. And we are going to see examples illustrating how that works. Okay, so we have interval-based plan and period-based plan. And continuing the discussion of the difference from old plans, it's a very nice feature is that it gives you the option, and we are going to discuss this in detail, of grouping your data based on certain common characteristics of routes, that it's going to be available only for the period-based plans, unfortunately, but, you know, it's a nice feature. And the plan revision, it's every 5 or every 9 years, depending whether you have to sample every year or every 3 years. That means when you determine a sample size using this template plan, you just need to revise your sample size only in the 6th year if you are sampling every year. So if you want to forget the template, you can for 5 years, and you keep doing exactly what you have been doing from the first time that you input your data into the template plan and got a sample size for any available plan. So, I mean, there are then, just to make a summary, 2 types of plans. We have period-based and interval-based plans. But now within these 2 types of plans, the template offers you ready-to-use plans and template sampling plans, which is this concept of inputting your data into the workbook. A ready-to-use sampling plan, we are going to discuss this in a minute. I'm going to talk about the ready-to-use sampling plan and why we have it. But let me introduce this concept first, is that we have options, that it's called the base option, which is usually, it's when you don't have unlinked trip, 100% count of trips, and you need to estimate unlinked trips, and in general produces large sample sizes. APTL option, which APTL stands for average passenger trip length. And it's a very attractive option, and it's available for all of you who have 100% count of unlinked trips, which is required for using this option. So we are going to see some examples showing how the APTL is in general much more efficient than the base option. And finally, there is a PPMT, which stands for Potential Passenger Miles Traveled. We are not covering this presentation. It's an interesting option, but we just don't want to overwhelm you with too many options. So it's covering the reporting manual, and you can look if you're interested, and you can also contact me if you want to discuss it in more detail. And finally, it's the grouping of data, which is available for most plans and allows you to make your samples even more efficient, even more smaller. Let's talk then about ready-to-use sampling plans. Why is that? What happens is that, let's assume that you don't have sample data for a given mode. So let's say, for instance, you're starting a new mode. Let's say there is a light rail, a new light rail system, that it's starting operations. It never existed before. So, I mean, you don't have any data to input into a template plan. Then, for that case, we are offering a ready-to-use sampling plan where you are going to find, and that's the reporting manual, documents and has tables showing what the sample size should be for this type of plan. Another situation is that when you're changing or you start a new type of service, let's say, for instance, that for a fixed route system, you always had directly operated service, but you are contracting out for some express routes now. And NTD requires a whole separate set of statistics for your new purchase transportation service. Again, for that case, you don't, even though the mode is the same, the type of service is not, and you can use then a ready-to-use sampling plan. Or another situation is that when you have sampling data from your previous sampling year, but for whatever reasons they are not reliable, or or they are incomplete, and in that case you can also use a ready-to-use sampling plan. Or let's say that your system, your route structure changed very significantly. Let's say, when I say a major change, I'm talking about 25%, let's say, changes in revenue mileage. Okay, so it's not just that you added a new route, or or you added some other small feature to your system, but there has been something that it really affects the structure of your service in a way that the data, to use the data from a previous sampling year, it's not going to represent what your new system is. And in that case, you also use a ready-to-use sampling plan. So there are ready-to-use sampling plans for most modes. Bus, and when I say bus, I'm referring to normal bus service or commuter bus or DRT or trolley bus. And for rail, we have plans for commuter rail and any other rail mode. And in addition to non-fixed route, plans for demand response and van pools. An important consideration to make is the sampling unit. In the case of fixed routes, for instance, the most common sampling unit is a one-way trip. That is, bus goes from A to B, A the beginning of the route, it goes to the end, that's point B, and that's a one-way trip. That's a sampling unit. But you're not limited to that. You can do a two-way trip or a round trip. That means that in that case, your sampling unit goes from A to B, and B goes back to A. So that's a round trip. It's very important that you stick to your sampling unit. That is, if you are using one-way trips, you keep using one-way trips, but more of that a little later. For a no-fixed route service, the sampling unit is vehicle-based. That means it's the number of vehicles that you have available and that are going to be in service during that day. So that would be the unit. And the ready-to-use sampling plans also, they have a base option and a PTL option with and without grouping. So you even can do a route grouping if you want in the APTL option. Now, let's talk about the other type, which is the objective of the template sampling plan, which is the template sampling plan proper, which requires your last mandatory sampling year. So in other words, let's say you sample last year, or you sample, the last time you sampled was 2 years ago. That's your most recent data, right? And that data you are going to feed into the system, as we're going to see a little later. And there are like several sampling options. As I said, we expanded this year with the introduction of the old sampling interval-based plan, sampling every X days. The template sampling plan should in general produce sample sizes smaller than the ready-to-use sampling plans. So with that, we are going to now show how you go into the template to choose the option that you need. The first thing, and at this point I'm going to open the template plan to show how we go over it, because the first thing that you have to decide is whether you want to do a period-based or interval-based, by the way, which is only for fixed route. The interval-based, it's only for bus, commuter bus, BRT, or trolleybus. Cannot be used, at least from this release, for any other mode. As you can see, this is the template plan, how it looks like. And the one I'm going to show you has data already entered into it to illustrate how it works. And as you can see here at the bottom, there are several tabs. There is a cover, and there are some introductory remarks here that I'm not going to cover right now, but you know, it's very useful for you to read this. And here on this row 66, as you can see, there is a checkbox. The first thing then that you need to do is decide whether you want to do an interval-based or a period-based. So if the box is checked, you would be doing the interval-based, okay, which is similar to the circular 2710.1a. But if you unclick it, okay, then everything else, all the other tabs are going to change, and they are going to be in a format that's proper for you to do the period-based plan, which is sampling weekly, monthly, or quarterly. So that would be then the first thing to decide. But more of that later. I'm going back to the presentation because we have some other important things to cover. Okay, so what I had here is a screenshot that showed that option where you decide on what plan to use, what type of plan to use. And I would like now to talk a little bit about the base option, which is an option that is very similar to old FTA circulars. That circular 2710.1a is a base option type of sampling. And let's give like a definition of what the base option means. The base option, it's related to the quantity that we are sampling. In this case here, the quantity we're interested is in passenger miles travel and unlinked passenger trips per sample trip. So in other words, what we want to find, to determine at the end of the sampling cycle, it's what was the passenger miles per trip and the unlinked passenger trips per trip. So that is the unit that we are looking, that we are interested in. And this plan, it's used mostly, and I would say they apply mostly for agencies that do not have 100% count of trips and require to sample unlinked trips as well. And I noticed that a few of you are in that situation. So the base option would be an alternative available for whoever does not have 100% count of trips. It's not advisable, and I wouldn't advise this option for whoever has 100% count of trips. But the fact is, if you want to use it, even if you have having 100% count of trips, then you have to keep in mind that you have to report to the NTD the 100% count. And you do not report the estimate of trips that this option gives you. And here's an example of what I just said. Let's say that we have 10 one-way bus trips, and the total passenger miles in the sample is 100,000. So my average, it's 1,000 passenger miles per one-way bus trip is the ratio of the two. So now what I do is, I know, let's say from your system, that in the year you have 2,000 one-way bus trips. Then your passenger miles that you report to NTD is just the average, this average, 1,000 passenger miles traveled, times the number of one-way bus trips. And in that case, that would give you 2 million passenger miles traveled. So that is the passenger miles. This is assuming then that the PMT per sample trip is the same PMT per trip of the universe of trips. We are extrapolating from our sample to the universe. The second option, the PTL option, which stands again average passenger trip length, it's available for both interval and period-based plans. And as I said before, the PTL is the average passenger trip length. It's the ratio of passenger miles divided by unlinked trips, by definition. So the PTL option, keep in mind that you need to have 100% count of trips to use it. If you don't, it's not available to you. And here, for example, a simple example of the PTL option, and you're going to see how different it is from the base option. Because here, from the 10 one-way bus trips, my total passenger miles, it was, let's say, 225,000. In my total unlinked trips, it's a different number here. What I'm looking for is the ratio of the two, because that's what APTL is. It's 1.5 miles per trip. So that's what the sample gives us. And now the extrapolation needs 100% count of trips, which you know, because you have 100% count of trips. You have a way of determining this statistic. So you just multiply one by the other to get the total passenger miles traveled. So the PTL from the sample and the PTL of the university, we assume then that they are the same, or not the same, but within the tolerance or the margin of error of 10% that FTA requires. And grouping, we're going to see practical examples of what grouping does for us. It's available for the period-based plan, unfortunately not yet, but may become available in the future for the interval-based plan. And it's the idea of the routes, they can be grouped based on common characteristics, like, let's say, you have express routes, or you have downtown circulators. It's like they're quite different. So if somehow you can create groups of routes that share these characteristics and treat each of these groups as a separate universe to estimate passenger miles, you can reduce sample size. So that means that you reduce the variance of what you try to determine, and that implies in reducing the sample size, and which implies in great efficiency, less cost. So when you're doing grouping, each group, it's a separate sample. In fact, it's like even if you have like two groups, you are doing two sampling processes simultaneously, concurrently. They never intersect in any way. what you're going to do is that at the end of your fiscal year, you are going to make an estimate of passenger miles traveled for each of these two, if you are using two groups, and you are adding your groups together only in the very end after you estimated the passenger miles for each of them. So the total passenger miles would be then the sum of all these groups. But in general, you should not do more than 3 groups. And ideally, I would even say, based on what I have seen from other agencies, 2 groups is ideal. It's easier to manage. It gives you most of the benefit of doing grouping. And it's easier to calculate. And I have seen cases where if you just add 3 groups, it adds complexity and the amount of work that needs to be done to compile the data without really great increase in benefit in terms of reducing sample size. But in fact, the way the template sampling plan was designed, it allows up to 10 groups. But I would never recommend you to use so many different groups. If you can stay within 2, a maximum of 3, that would be great. The grouping, when applied to different options, imply in classifying the data by different ways. For instance, if I'm grouping for the PTL option, it makes a lot of sense to create one group where you have, let's say, routes that they have very short average passenger trip length, like downtown circulators or the routes where you know that the average trip length is small. In another group, you have longer routes, more express, commuter-oriented routes. There would be a one way of doing, for example, 2 groups in the PTL option. And in the slide, I mean, again, when you're doing grouping, each group is a separate sample, and each sample, it's going to give you an estimate of passenger miles for each of these groups. Now we are going to talk about, and we are going back to the template sampling plan because how we use it. So we want to find and what the template gives us sample size for different options. Okay? So we need the last mandatory sampling year, and we can create groups. And I would, at this point, go back to our spreadsheet. Okay, let's assume that you are doing the period-based plan, in which case, what you need to do, on this tab, there is a tab that's called Period Input. Okay? And first I want to show you this on this tab where the data would be entered. If you can see starting here, row 71, I have columns for date. So that's the date of the sample. An ID, it could be a time or it could be another number that it's up to you to decide how you identify your samples. And here, what it's really mandatory are these 2 columns, columns D and E. You need unlinked trips and passenger miles traveled for each sample from your last mandatory sampling year. In this example, it's also adding PPMT, but I'm not talking about that. And you're going to see that there is a column here which is also optional. But in this example, the routes were grouped. And the group here, it has short routes, medium routes, and long routes. As you can see, every trip in the sample is one of these 3. So as you can see, this is a sample. Let's see how many records it has. It's from the previous mandatory sampling here. It had approximately 540 trips, sample trips, that were fed here into the template. And by looking here, because we are doing grouping, for each of the 3 types of routes, I enter for that sampling year, where the data, which corresponds to the data we just saw down, we put the number of service units for each of them. That means in that report year, we have 109,685 short trips for short routes. and the number for median and long routes, they are entered on these cells. And for the upcoming year, you make an estimate. If you think it's going to be the same as in this example, what should its expected number of trips by group, the short, medium, and long routes? With that, you are almost done. The only last thing that you need to do is to indicate whether you have a reliable count of unlinked trips at route level. Because sometimes an agency can have a count of unlinked trips at system-wide level, but cannot say for sure how many trips they had at route level, because sometimes the counter was not reset when a bus changed from one route to another. So if you do know your count of trips at route level, you enter 1 here, or otherwise you just enter 0. That's it. Now if you go to the next tab, period plans, and that's what you're looking for, it's going to show you this table, which shows your sampling options here. As you can see, there is, for each of annual frequency, quarterly, monthly, and weekly, you can see that you have the base option, a PTL option, and the PPMT option. And the first set of rows, this here is just the annual frequency. That means that if you are using the base option, the sample size is 348. But if you use the PTL option, your sample size is only 70. That means you just need to sample 70 trips for the year, as opposed to 348 for the base option. As you can see how different this can be from one option to another. And most of you would benefit from this APTL option, given the fact that most of you have 100% count of trips. But even more than that, let's take a look. This spot here with grouping, it's going to show only if you grouped your data by group, and it's going to show you what's the sample size for each of the groups you defined: short routes, medium routes, and long routes. So let's say in the PTL option, when we do the short routes, that means you have, for the short routes, you just need to sample 15 trips for the entire year. The medium routes, that would be more, 46, and long routes, 10. But when you look here, the total, 71, there is not really a lot of difference of the required sample size without grouping, right? I mean, if you look at these two columns here, it's without grouping, and those are with grouping. When you compare the totals, you see that in the case of the PTL option, there was not a big difference by grouping or not grouping. So you may well prefer not group, because that would be extra work. But if you look at the base option, if you are stuck with the base option because you don't have 100% count of trips, then there is a difference, because 295, it's the annual sample size. In the grouping, it would be less than the sample size without grouping. So these things are important and help you make a decision what's most convenient and most efficient plan for you. And another thing that helps you, because as I mentioned, in the interval, in the sampling method, you do it quarterly, monthly, or weekly. So if you're doing weekly, it shows you here how many samples you need to collect in a weekly basis for each of the options. Okay, so in the base option would be 7, which results in an annualized sample size of 364. And the PTL option, as you can see, that would be 104. Okay? And if you're doing monthly or quarterly, it shows you how many samples you need to collect by period and the annualized sample size. If you look and compare, it seems that apparently there is a contradiction, because it says here that the PTL option requires only 70 trips. Let's not think about grouping. But when you go to the weekly frequency, the annualized size is 104. So it's 30 trips more than the annual frequency indicates. The reason is that because of rounding. This 2 trips here that you see was probably not, the result of the formula was not exactly 2. It was, let's say, 1.2. But the template rounds up. So it rounds up every trip. And so when you add them up, you end up with a number that is greater than the annual frequency requirement would be. Okay, it's just to be on the safe side. The formulas, they all round up the numbers. Okay, so if you want to minimize this problem, instead of like sampling too frequently, or say on a weekly basis, you can think on a monthly or even a quarterly basis. Because look, in a quarterly basis, the difference is almost the same. You see, it's 70 to 72. And in a monthly frequency, there is no change either. It's 72. So perhaps the monthly frequency would be the best alternative to follow. And so what you see here, it's what all of this is about. It's to give you the sample size for each of these options that you have available. Now let's talk about the interval-based plan. And here, unfortunately, this is a limitation of the system at the present time, which are working to change in future releases of the template sampling plan, which is when you want, and it's common that you want to explore your alternatives. And so you would like not just to try the period-based plan, what plans are available, but you also want to look into interval-based plans, or you, in principle, are interested in interval-based. But you also would like to look at period-based plans as a way of studying what's the best alternative available for you. Here is the fact that the data that we just saw entered in the period-based plan, it has to be re-entered. The same data has to be re-entered again. Because here the methodology is different, and unfortunately, of course, the idea would be that you have to enter only once, and the system fetches the data and do the proper calculations. But here it's different because we need to enter the days of the week and the trips correct in that given day. At this point, let's go back to the spreadsheet. And the difference would be is that I would, under the cover, the first template, I would check this box. Okay? And by doing that, everything turns into interval-based. So here there is an interval, there is a short intro, which I recommend you to read. And finally, it comes to the place where you enter the information. So the first thing is that you enter here the number of weekdays that you operate. Usually it's 5, 6, or 7. The number of daily service units, I mean, that would be, let's say, for instance, during weekdays you have something like 500. Weekends you have less. You don't have to do an average or anything like that. Just enter the maximum number of service units in any day of the week. So in that case, let's suppose that in a Tuesday you have 500, and which is more or less what you also have in the other days of the week. Okay? And you all, here, as you're going to see, the data is outlined differently. Because we have, here is, let's say, this plan was sampled every second day. Look, it starts January 2nd, 2006. Then the next sampling day was January 4th, January 6th, 8th, 10, etc. to December 30th, 2006. There was like, I don't know how many samples we have here. No, 160 sampling days. Because for each of these days, these numbers here represent a sample trip that day. So as you can see, this tab can accommodate up to 10 trips, which is more than sufficient in most cases. So in January 2nd, 2006, 3 trips were sampled that day. So it seems to me from this example that the guy was required to sample every second day 3 trips randomly, 3 random trips. And here you can see that they enter the passenger miles traveled for trips 1, 2, and 3, and the corresponding trips for trips 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so as you keep looking here, let's say in one day they sample only 2. I mean, it's not essential that all samples have exactly the same number of trips. But what's important is that they have at least 2 samples every day. And because that's how the system works, you cannot just have one day to determine the sample size. So you enter this data here, which was for your last mandatory sampling year, and the number of weekday service operated and the number of days operated, and you click on the interval plans, and it shows you what options are available to you in both APTL and base option. So let's say in the APTL option, if you want to sample every day, you just need to do 1 random sample every day for a total sample size of 365. Or if you want to do every second day, every third, fourth, fifth, and sixth, the options 5 and 6, they show here because this is a 7-day operation, right? And the annual total sample, it shows here, which is the count of what you're going to need to sample. In the base option, the same thing, except that as you can see, it's the sample sizes, it's significantly bigger than the PTL option, especially when you sample less frequently. Sometimes you don't want to sample every day or every second day because the way you operate, it's more convenient for you to do 1 sample a week, let's say. That would mean every 6th day. But that would, let's say for instance, first of all, that wouldn't be available for the base option. So when an option is not available, it shows an N-A. You would have to do, let's say, the every 6th day. If you can use the PTL option, which you need to have 100% count of trips, and that requires 2 trips every 6th day for a total of 122 samples. Or if you want to do every day or every second day, because it's more convenient to do less trips, even though here the difference it's insignificant, but that's an example. Your data can show numbers that are quite different, but that would be 183 samples. So you can pick whichever is available here. So with this, this covers the most important features of the template, and I'm going back to cover some additional issues. And I would like to talk a little bit about a very important feature, or not a feature, but a requirement when you do sampling, which is the randomness of the sampling. We have noticed that sometimes a very precise and accurate work of collecting the information was completely destroyed because the way the trips were selected were not proper, were not random as they should. So by randomness, that means that when you're selecting trips in a day, all trips that you have available that you're going to have service that day should have an equal chance of being selected. And that you wouldn't discard a sample based on some problems or difficulty that you face for collecting that sample. So for instance, I have seen cases of people that would discard any sample that fell randomly, let's say after 8 p.m., because the drivers wouldn't collect the information, because there was nobody available after 8 p.m. So that is wrong, because by doing that, by discarding any sample that falls after a certain time, or discarding a sample that belongs to a certain route that it's difficult to get the data for, you are invalidating the entire process of a full year effort. So that's why this is so important. And that violates NTD procedures by not using an accurate sampling method. It's key results and generates validation questions for analysts, may result, as I said, in the loss of a work of an entire year. So it's essential for doing that. The first thing that you need to look for is it's important to have a complete set of all trips that are going to happen in a sampling day. I mean, it requires sometimes a very good coordination between your scheduling department and whoever is responsible for sampling, if not the scheduling department, in such a way that the scheduling department is always communicating and updating you on the schedule for all days, including, and very important, the days that you are sampling, because you want to make sure that you have the complete universe to select from. And there are many different ways, and in the reporting manual, the sampling reporting manual, it covers a way of generating random numbers, that it's using random tables, random number tables, which are not covering here. And I personally don't like them very much. But it's a valid process. I just think that there are better alternatives. And I'm going to give you an example here of how you can generate a random sample. And it's perfectly acceptable for NTD purposes. But I want to make sure that everybody understands that there are many different other ways of doing this. But I want to show you the example of the rand-between function in Excel, which gives you a random number between two parameters, A and B. So A is the initial number, let's say is 1, and B would be a number that would represent the last trip of that day. Let's say you have 1,000 trips a day. So if you do rand between 1, 1,000, it generates a random number between 1 and 1,000, let's say 322. If you can associate this number to a route and a trip number, you just know exactly what you need to sample. So I have some examples here that it's going to show how to apply that. Let's say, for instance, the period-based plans, remember what I said, that the day that you sample is also random. It's a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. In the travel-based plans, the day is not random, but the route and trip selection is, right? So let's give an example here of a plan where the agency is doing period-based, sampling weekly. It has a weekday schedule and it has a Saturday schedule. And let's say that they are required to sample 4 trips per week. And it's a week that goes from November 8th to November 13, 2010. So I outline here in this fictitious example, it's a very simple example because I just want to show the technique. I outline the data in a format that you absolutely don't have to follow exactly. But for illustration purposes, it works. As you can see, I numbered the columns, routes and trips. So the 7 first columns are for route. The first route I call route 1. It has 7 trips. Are followed by a route 2 that has 4 trips. And the third route that has 3 trips. Okay? And here the rows represent the days of the week. So let's say from Monday to Wednesday, all these routes and trips that I put here in the header, they are going to happen. So I numbered them sequentially, as you can see, up to 42. Just a Thursday, this third trip here for Route 3, it doesn't happen. And the same for Friday. So I skip this because, this is not a trip that can possibly happen. And I do this for Saturday as well, where I have less trips. The following week, it repeats again, the same pattern. So as you can see, I just outlined here, this is my universe of trips for that week. There is no trip that it's going to happen that's not here, because I coordinated with the scheduling department, or I know that whatever change that would happen, I would be notified and I would have a chance to update this. Okay? Then what I need to do is to select 4 random trips of a total of 74 trips. So how do I do that? You can use the randBetween function 4 times. Okay, let's say that you get numbers 16, 28, 29, 53. And I highlighted here in red these numbers. And now you have your sampling schedule for that week. You know that the first sample, it's on a Tuesday, November 9th, and it's going to be Route 1, trip number 2, which has like a time associated with it. And I'm going to do another, the same Tuesday, there is another one, which is Route 3, the third trip of Route 3. And finally, and then I have Wednesday, and I have Thursday. And that's it. So I just need to have someone, or the driver, if it's the person responsible for collecting the data, to sample exactly these trips. Don't skip any. If you miss or if you lose one for whatever reason, some extraneous circumstance that prevented you, I'm going to talk about that my closing remarks. But it's very important that you keep as much as possible within what your random number generation gave you. Let's say, for instance, in the same example, for the second week, I already had a totally different set of trips to sample. That it's going to be Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. It could be any combination of days, routes, and trip numbers. So you need to have and to be aware that that week you need to have someone available all the time to collect sample data. The driver is the most natural individual to think of, but I have some reservations about using drivers too. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Just to give an example, this can become really overwhelming. Let's say, for instance, that instead of doing a weekly basis, you want to do on a monthly basis. And in that case, let's say that the plan requires 20 random trips, and the numbers, even in this very simple case, there's like 424 trips to select that you need to account for to select 20 random trips. And here's an example of 20 trips selected. So in this monthly plan, you can easily identify the days of the week that you are going to have to sample and the route and trip numbers. So again, but in a real type of operation, this can become overwhelming. And this matrix becomes so large that it's unmanageable. And if that happens, you should either think about a more frequency, like weekly, or you think about the interval-based plan, which requires you to sample systematically every X number of days. Just a little talk here about demand response paratransit, and also applies to Venpool, is that it's very similar in concept to fixed route, except that the unit, as we discussed before, it's the vehicle day, and it's not one or two-way trips. But the process is the same. Let's say that you will have 14 vehicles from Monday to Tuesday, but then you have 11 the remaining of the weekdays, and on Saturday you have only 2. So you number them sequentially, and here's an example where the 36, which is vehicle 8, was selected, and in the following week, it was already a different one. So in this case, it was one random trip per week. And contrasting with these two cases, in the interval-based example, which many of you should be familiar with because you used the 2710.1a plan, I think it's less overwhelming. This is also a sampling schedule for an entire month. But as you can see, there are less numbers to handle because the numbers never get higher than 14, let's say. Because here I'm sampling every second day. You can see that highlighted in green are the required sample days. And I have exactly the same set of trips as in the previous example, except that here you can see that I have, let's say, the requirement is 2 samples every second day. So as you can see, the first day I selected these 2 trips. On the Tuesday, there would be this and this, etc. And as you follow, you would then select, you would have here your plan for the entire month of what trips to sample. And here, the day is, you know beforehand what day you are going to sample, right? So as I was saying, this function ran between is very useful. There are many other ways. Even if you make a search in the web, you're going to find other functions that can give you random numbers, and they are acceptable too. This is just an example because it's available in Excel. And, we put the smallest, the first, and the last value, and it's going to pick a random number between these numbers. Except that if you need to do 4 times, you need to apply it 4 times, so that each time it's going to give you a different random number. So in order to enable the rand between function, and if you're interested in this method, I ask you to make a note of this. You need to go in the add-ins. This is, I think, Excel 2007. I don't know if 2010, it's the same. You need to do exactly this. But you need to make sure that the analysis toolpack is checked. The box analysis toolpack is checked. You click OK, and then it will enable the rand between function. In the 2007 Excel version, the rand between function is disabled unless you enable it. We discussed this. Any changes in the schedule, you should always keep current your master file of trips. That's because that's what you use to generate your random trips. And that requires coordination between a department and the agency if there are more than one department involved. And I haven't talked much about APC equipped buses. This is a totally different, it's a topic on its own. There's very specific requirements the NTD imposes for using APC data, to report APC data or APC-based data to the NTD. But in principle, they can be used in the data collection process for collecting not only link trips, bodies and alightings, but passenger miles itself. APC technology allows you to do that, but there are some requirements in terms of making maintenance plan, calibration plan, where you compare the APC data with manual counts to make sure that there is consistency and some other considerations too. But what is important to keep in mind, and I noticed that in a few cases, some agencies where sometimes the basic method for collecting data was APCs, but not the entire fleet was APC equipped. And some routes would never have an APC equipped bus assigned to it because of operating details that I'm not aware of. But that happens that in the random sampling, sometimes that route would be selected randomly. But the agency would simply discard that sample because he could not assign an APC equipped bus to collect the data. And by doing that, he just, without realizing that he was destroying his effort for the entire year because he biased his sample. Only trips that are served with APC-equipped buses were part of this final sample. And I'm sure that most of you that have done sample before have seen a table like this where it shows actually the data that you collected in one sample, the ons and offs. I mean, in this case, for instance, you have the sequential stop numbers and the distance between stops and the number of boardings highlighted in red and the passenger miles traveled. It's a very straightforward process by which you just multiply essentially the load between two stops times the distance between them. And actually, if you look, it's exactly what you see here in this graph in blue. The passenger miles traveled is the area under this curve, which is this number here. So I'm not going into like more detail because it's self-explanatory here. You can look and see how the calculations were made. I mean, if you have questions, I will be more than available to help you. And finally, I want to talk about data validation. It's very important that once you collect the data, the sample data, it goes into a system of records like a spreadsheet or some other database, access database, whatever, where the data is entered and subjected to some minimum level of validation, such as, let's say, there should be some correlation between passenger miles and unlimited trips. In general, passenger miles is greater than unlimited trips. Not always, but in general is. Or like some black and white rules that you can apply to your samples. And you can verify whether there is a typo, or if there is a problem that in no circumstance can indicate that the data is correct. Let's say, for instance, the route mileage has to be greater than the average passenger trip length, because a passenger cannot travel more than the total mileage of the route. Something like that. It's like black and white rule that it can be spotted, from the data that you get from the drivers, wherever it's collecting the information. The load cannot be greater than the maximum load capacity. And so there are like a number of rules that they need to be followed in order to guarantee that the data is accurate. So validating your data early in the process makes your life much easier, because once you submit the data to the NTD, the analyst that's going to look into your data, they are going to compare estimates for the annual total. It's going to address to you in a way that you may not have the answer immediately available. That requires you to look into detailed records to find where the problem is. But if you do a basic set of validation checks into your sample, and whatever, if it cannot be correct, there's up to 2% of your sample size in general you can discard, because it's not, there was a mistake, and it's not something that can be recovered. Okay, and so there are some other tips here that I leave for you to read afterwards, because I would like to hear questions. You can pre-populate, for instance, the distance between stops. So in other words, in a fixed route system, and you don't have route deviation, you don't need to measure distances, because the distances are preset by the mileage of the stops. So you just need to collect ons and offs. Well, and that's what we want to cover. This was developed by Dr. Shuhao Shu from the University of South Florida, and we are very thankful for him for his work. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us, myself, or our project manager, John Georges, or our NTD Help Desk. We are here to help. And, I enjoy this type of thing. I mean, if you want to discuss your case with me, or I would be more than glad to do that. And at this point, I will open then for your questions. Thank you.